What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the JT Sports Podcast. I'm your host, JT. On this episode, I want to break down how the 12-team college football playoffs has created a civil war in college football. And I want to give my thoughts on North Carolina interviewing Bill Belichick for their head coaching vacancy and why it's a no-brainer for them to hire him. Before we get into it, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, hit that bell icon so you don't miss when we drop new content. Also, you can check us out on all podcasting platforms, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you get your podcast from. The JT Sports Podcast is available. The links are down in the description down below, and let's dive into it. I don't know how many of y'all realize this right now, but the 12-team college football playoffs has caused a civil war in college football. You got coaches like Lane Kiffin throwing dirt on other teams that are ranked ahead of them. You got athletic directors going after each other over whose team played the tougher schedule. You got the ACC and the Big 12 commissioners feeling like their conferences are being heavily disrespected because in their minds, their conferences are just as good as what the SEC and the Big 10 are. And how did we get here? Well, for one, there's been a lack of transparency by the playoff committee with how they have ranked these teams. At first, they went off the eye test. They didn't really care about your strength of schedule. They cared about how you looked on Saturdays. How did you perform in these games? And then all of a sudden, the last couple of rankings that they've put out, they now want to say, bump the eye test. We care about strength of schedule when it favors a 3-loss Alabama team that lost to Vanderbilt and Oklahoma, right? And you can't get too mad at the committee for the inconsistencies in these rankings because it's hard to pick who are the 12 best teams this year because there's a drought on elite teams this season. The only elite team is Oregon. From week 1 to now, they've been the most consistent team in college football. They've beaten the teams that they've supposed to beat, and they also beat the toughest teams on their schedule, which their best win is against Ohio State. But outside of Oregon, you don't have any more elite teams. You have a bunch of good teams, like the SEC doesn't have any elite teams. The ACC and the Big 12, not only do they not have any elite or good teams, but the best teams that are going to be able to get into the playoffs from their conferences are probably about above average at best. You got BYU fans thinking that they deserve a spot in the playoffs when your only good win is against SMU. And if SMU loses to Clemson in the ACC title game, they're not going to get in most likely. And what a lot of people don't want to understand is that not every conference is equal. Just because you play Division I college football, you play in a P4 conference, doesn't mean that your conference is as good as everybody else. There are levels to this. There's a reasoning for why the SEC has had the most players drafted into the NFL over the last 2 decades. There is a reason why the majority of college football's best coaches reside in the Southeastern Conference or in the Big 10. And people just can't seem to understand that, or they just want to deny it. The SEC, although they are lacking an elite team from top to bottom, the discrepancy in talent between a Georgia and a Florida is not as wide as what the discrepancy in talent has been in the Big 10 this year. There is a large gap between Indiana, Penn State, Oregon, Ohio State, and everybody else in that conference. But with the Big 12, though, the gap isn't really that wide. The gap between Arizona State, Iowa State, and everybody else in the Big 12 is not big at all. As a matter of fact, every team in that conference is pretty much equal in terms of a talent standpoint. The only difference is how these teams have performed. But let's not act like the SEC hasn't had a winning record over the Big 12 this year. You know, the SEC has a winning record against all of the other P4 conferences this year. But with the SEC cannibalizing itself with how many quality teams are in this conference and them getting rid of divisions, it has hurt this conference chances of getting more teams into the playoffs this year. Although you do play in the toughest conference in college football, it still doesn't mean that all your 3-loss teams have a right into the playoffs when you've lost more games than, some of the teams that are going to get in over you. And it is the SEC's fault why they put themselves in this position, why they feel like Ole Miss and South Carolina are getting snubbed, because if you would have had divisions, then you wouldn't have had this problem. There would have been a little bit more balance. But by getting rid of divisions, same thing with the Big Ten and all of the other conferences, the tiebreaker scenarios have been kind of weird. How can I tell the difference between three-loss SEC teams, who's actually better? You can say the resume could tell you who's better, but if we're going off the resume, Alabama is better than Ole Miss. They are better than Georgia. Even though they have more losses than Georgia, the difference is Alabama has more ranked wins against Georgia. Well, Georgia has had the toughest schedule in that conference. They had 3 road trips on the road in Tuscaloosa, on the road to play Texas and Austin. They had to play Ole Miss on the road as well. It's just really hard to separate which teams actually are deserving of a playoff spot with how the divisions have just gone away, and now you have a log jam at the top. And going into this season for the Big 12, it was expected that Utah was going to win that conference. And with them being bad, who really in that conference can you say is elite? Can you really say that whoever wins the Big 12 title game is one of the best 12 teams in college football? Because I can't really get behind that. Just because you won your conference doesn't mean you are one of the top 12 teams in the nation. You see, we don't have any clear definitions of what makes a top 12 team in college football. And the committee doesn't have any guidelines for how they rank these teams. You're saying that we're judging teams based off the eye test for the first 3 rankings you put out. Then for the final couple of rankings, you want to say, you know what, bump the eye test. We now are going off strength of schedule, and we're going to use other metrics to evaluate who gets in. It's just been a complete shit show when it comes to this. And that's why you have a civil war breaking out in college football. Lane Kiffin has a right to be upset. Ole Miss has just as good as an argument to get into the playoffs as what Alabama and South Carolina have. Yeah, they have some ugly losses, but so does Alabama. What makes Alabama's ugly losses to Oklahoma and Vandy any better than Ole Miss losing to Kentucky, LSU, and Florida? All of those losses are just as bad, in my opinion. What about Notre Dame losing to Northern Illinois? We just want to forget about that? But with the whole stereotype about how good the Big Ten and the SEC are and who will be favored on the neutral field, it has diluted a lot of these discussions because people just want to assume that just because you play in the Big Ten and the SEC, you're better than everybody else, when that's not the case. And you can't say that, the odds show who's the best teams, because the odds also favored Ole Miss beating Kentucky, and Ole Miss lost that game. They also were a favorite on the road against Georgia. They lost, or a favorite on the road against Florida, and they lost that game. Alabama was a favorite in their losses to Vandy and Oklahoma. So if you're losing the teams that you're favored to beat, you just can't necessarily say that it's a guarantee that you will smoke a Big 12 team, or if you put Ole Miss in the Big 12, they just will run the gauntlet on that conference, because that's a hypothetical. The SEC is undefeated when it comes to hypotheticals, right? But what makes that argument illogical, in my opinion, is that, yeah, you would be favored against a lot of these teams that could get into the playoffs over you, but that doesn't mean that you necessarily will beat them when you were favored in all the games that you lost this year against crappy teams in this conference. At least Indiana was able to beat the teams that they were supposed to beat. Same thing with the couple of top teams in the Big 12. Everybody has had some ugly losses, but with how much inconsistency we have been getting from the committee with these rankings and their justification for where these teams are seated, where they're at, is why we have a civil war going on. North Carolina has interviewed Bill Belichick for their head coaching vacancy. I'm really surprised that they allowed Belichick to walk out of the facilities without a contract, because if you hire Bill Belichick, he instantly would become the best head coach in college football. Although he hasn't coached at this level as a head man, he's an 8-time Super Bowl champion. He knows what it takes to build a championship winning team. If you can dominate and become the GOAT in the NFL, you can do the same thing in college football, because let's just be honest, college football is the NFL 2.0. You can buy players out of high school. You can buy players out of the transfer portal. So that's why making the decision to hire Bill Belichick, to me, is a no-brainer, because college football isn't what it used to be a decade ago. You know, where it was a different game. Now you just throw money at whoever you want and you can get them on your team. So what's the difference between Bill Belichick coaching in the NFL and coaching in college? Well, he might not be able to do a good job connecting with younger players. His girlfriend is 24 years old. They got like a 40-something year old age gap. So if he's connecting with his young girlfriend, you mean to tell me that he can't connect with these 18 and 19-year-olds? And Bill Belichick, to me, he would have easy success on a recruiting trail. You want to know why? Because all he has to do to sell himself to recruits is say, I'm Bill Belichick. I'm an 8-time Super Bowl champion. I am the greatest head coach in NFL history. I coached two of the greatest players to ever play the game of football, Tom Brady and Lawrence Taylor. I know how to develop you, and I know how to get you into the NFL. That is the pitch that Bill Belichick can use to sell recruits on playing for North Carolina. And if the Tar Heels were to make this move, I would be interested in seeing just how many of these players value being developed for the next level, like how they say, because you got a lot of players that commit the team saying that, yeah, I believe this was the best program who could develop me for the NFL, when if they were being honest, they just picked that program because they gave them the largest bag. Well, North Carolina, although they don't have as much NIL money as what Ohio State, Texas, and Oregon do, they do have enough that they can put together a national championship caliber team with the prestige that comes with the head coach like Bill Belichick. When you have somebody that has this kind of reputation, players are willing to take a discount. Players are taking discounts to play for Deion Sanders. I'm pretty sure Jordan Seaton could have made more money if he would have played for Texas, Alabama, or anybody else if he wouldn't have went to Colorado. But he took that discount because of Deion Sanders. And Bill Belichick is going to have that same effect on recruits as what Deion Sanders has at Colorado. Plus, North Carolina has an elite basketball program. They put a lot of money into their basketball team. So if they have that money to spend in basketball, they also have that money to put into football. They just need the right head coach who can get the most out of those younger players. And another reason why hiring Bill Belichick would make North Carolina a respectable football program is, for one, Bill Belichick, he would easily outcoach everybody in the ACC. The ACC is one of the weakest conferences in all of college football. Bill Belichick, he would easily coach circles around Mario Cristobal, Dabo Swinney. He has a good understanding of how to develop good offensive linemen and good defensive linemen. He's an elite strategist. His defensive schemes will give a lot of the coordinators in the ACC and a lot of those quarterbacks headaches. I mean, Bill Belichick getting hired by North Carolina, if I'm their athletic director, I would have already pulled the trigger, because college football, the gap between this sport and the NFL, there really isn't none. With how the playoffs is formatted, how guys are pretty much getting in the bidding wars for some of the top guys out of high school and in the transfer portal, the transition from the NFL to the college game, has never been easier, especially for a guy like Bill Belichick that has such a polarizing name. Some of y'all make it seem like these high school recruits, these guys in the transfer portal, don't watch the NFL at all. They know who Bill Belichick is. And if they really cared about getting developed for the next level, they would play for Bill Belichick. I mean, this guy has coached some of the greatest defensive players ever. So I would love to see North Carolina make this move. I think that this would be the best hire that they could have made. This could be their equivalent to Alabama hiring Nick Saban or Ohio State hiring Urban Meyer. They're not going to be able to lure that kind of coach that has that kind of name from the college game. So why not go ahead and get the greatest head coach in NFL history when college football pretty much is the equivalent to what the NFL is? Hiring Bill Belichick for North Carolina is a no-brainer.